So I'll start off with a thank you to the UDI. It was in black and white, and I've been doing this for 43 years. But I used to do my sort of forecast talk once a year, and now we've done this for a couple of years, and I really enjoy it. And I have to tell you, I am so honored that the UDI lets me play in their sandbox and just to be affiliated with everybody. So thank you. To Steve, thank you very much for coming back up to Vancouver. It's good to have you. It's been a little over a year since you were here. And for those of you that were not with us last year and maybe know a little bit about Steve, Steve's knowledge of the US Constitution, political history, and all that is Washington it's frankly breathtaking. But Steve's role as the political strategist for Schwarzenegger, for Bush, for McCain, very well known, very well publicized on MSNBC. But what you may not know is there's not a major Fortune 500 company or a top executive in America when they're in crisis that doesn't have Steve as their first call, or certainly wish that they did. And we're just so honored to have you here today, Steve. Thank you. So last year when Steve was here, Trump had only been in office for 3.5 months. Mueller had just been appointed, I think, a day before, and this is the 1-year anniversary today of Mueller being appointed as special counsel to investigate Russia's interference in the 2016 US election. And I thought to put things in context, and Steve and I talked about this, is I wanted to just put 2 clips up. The first clip, where Julianne Moore played Sarah Palin in the movie Game Change, and Woody Harrelson played Steve. And how hot is that to have Woody Harrelson play you, Steve? Was it your choice?
Woody's a great guy, and he's become a good friend of mine over the years, but he said the hardest role he ever played, he said he thought early in his career is when he played a cop for the first time. He said, but the hardest thing he ever did was having to play a Republican.
So this first clip, we did play it last year, but I think what's going on in America, and especially with Senator McCain, that it is so timeless, and it's 2 minutes and 12 seconds that captures the portrayal of Steve and Senator McCain in a very nonpartisan moment that's very rare in politics. So could we put up that clip?
I can't trust Obama. I've read about him, and he's an Arab. He's not
No, ma'am. No, ma'am. He's a decent family man, citizen who I just happen to have disagreements with on certain fundamental issues. And that's what this campaign is all about. He's not. Thank you.
Cutting through the bull tonight on the eve of the election, the campaigns are relying on their lucky charms. That was just a story on UDI.com earlier today.
How's he doing? He's the most depressed I've seen him the entire campaign. I can't get him to stop watching MSNBC, which only makes him more miserable. I'm amazed that someone who has been in politics this long takes all the petty stuff so personally.
Well, that's why they are who they are. It's Reagan, Bush, Clinton, all they want is to be loved. The ones that don't pathologically need to be loved, they don't get the nomination. They don't get to be president. If you'd understood that fact, you might have been able to better handle our Alaskan moose hunter. God, it was a tough campaign.
It wasn't a campaign, it was a bad reality show.
She didn't cost us the election. That was Bush, that was the economy. That was just the cold hand of fate. We didn't have a chance.
And if we did win, would you feel comfortable with President Palin?
Why not? Then we would have won. Well, guys, listen, I too wish that the American people would choose the future Abraham Lincoln or Thomas Jefferson. But unfortunately, that's not the way it works anymore. Now it takes movie star charisma to get elected president. And Obama and Palin, that's what they are. They're stars.
Primary difference being Sarah Palin can't name a Supreme Court decision, whereas Barack Obama was a constitutional law professor.
Fuck you.
So I think it's so appropriate in 2012 that they were predicting that a celebrity apprentice type president was on its way. So the next clip that I'm going to show you, and I was originally going to just show you 14 seconds of it, but it's 4 minutes, but it showed on Friday. Let's just put it up and then we'll talk about it. So can you put the second clip up?
It's not how you die, it's how you live. And let's talk about John McCain's life. He put the uniform of the country on when he was 17 years old, and except for the 6 months when he was a congressional candidate, he has spent every hour of his adult life in service to this country. And he served his country through horrible torture and unbearable pain, and he kept faith with the country. John McCain is an imperfect man. He has many flaws, he'll be the first to tell you. But he has always loved America perfectly, and he has served America honorably. I was asked a couple days ago at something I was speaking at about who will take John McCain's place. And of course the answer to that question is nobody. 500 years from now, should America endure, there won't be another John McCain. We'll never see anybody like this in high public office in American life ever again. We should not fall out of our chairs that a vile person like Kelly Sadler works in this corrupt and vile administration. We see it every day. But when we look at why Donald Trump isn't going to be invited to John McCain's funeral, it's because of how they've lived their lives. John McCain's life was honorable. It was about service to others. It was about reconciliation. We don't talk enough about this, but I was in Vietnam a couple weeks ago. And if you go to Vietnam, the Vietnamese revere 3 American warriors. They revere John Kerry, they revere John McCain, and they revere Pete Peterson, a fellow POW of John McCain's who was the first ambassador when diplomatic relations were restored. Those 3 men, veterans of that war, but John McCain tortured repeatedly. He was an instrumental leader in the reconciliation of our countries so that this generation could be friends. His life has been about decency and honor, compared to a president who's unworthy to say his name out loud, a man who is small and vile and mean and cruel and narcissistic, a man who's a coward, a man who dodged the draft, a man profoundly unworthy enough that he can't even understand at a conceptual level the meaning of John McCain's life. The virtues and the values that John McCain stands for in his long life of service to this country are unextinguishable. They light the sky like a star to guide us to the antidote for this vile, debased, corrupt administration. And so Meghan McCain had it exactly right. It's about how you live your life. And Kelly Sadler and all the people in that White House that are tearing down our institutions, pitting American against American, they're exactly the opposite of John McCain. He's a guy that I've known well, and I was honored to have a small role in the giant chapter that he wrote in American life. There were times where he infuriated me, he enraged me, he inspired me, he made me laugh, he kicked me in the ass when I deserved it, and he put an arm around me when I needed it. I love him very much, and despite all his flaws, I'll just say, he is the greatest man I've ever known. And he is the type of man that I would aspire, and I think any parent in this country would aspire for their son to be like. And I don't think there's a lot of parents out in this country today who are saying, I want my kid to grow up like Donald Trump. And one thing I know for sure, there will never be a person on television, not now and not for 1,000 eons, that ever says what I just said about John McCain of Donald Trump, that he's a great man. He's a small and vile man. And that's the difference between the two men.
So you won't see that on Fox. But I think that 4 minutes and 35 seconds will be watched for years and years and years as this defining cultural moment on a sitting president. But so over the next 55 minutes, what we'd like to do is get to know everything that's Trump. But before we get to that, and just on a serious note, is I think we would all be remiss to not acknowledge that a dear friend of yours is dying. And we would be remiss to not acknowledge the other challenge you have is the way that the White House is being so dismissive and so callous. So having said all that, I believe that the Gina Haspel's refusal to acknowledge torture and its immorality, Kelly Sandler's "he's going to die anyway," and Senator McCain's funeral plans of clearly not inviting President Trump to the funeral, I believe that those are all catalysts for discussion, and the man will be honored more because of these things than less. So I think just my really simple question to you is, you know, the 4 minutes that we just saw and what's going on out there with those three topics, you were pretty passionate there. Where's this going?
Well, first, let me just say it's a pleasure to be back in Vancouver. This is a city I love. I tell everybody this is my favorite city in North America. I would move here in a second. So it's always a pleasure for me to be up here, and it's always good to see my friend Bob, and it's happy to be back here doing this the second year in a row. And talking about John McCain, as we talk about American politics, I usually console people who are disconsolate about the state of our political affairs south of the border with these words, a favorite quote of John McCain's, quoting Chairman Mao, which is to remember, it is always darkest before it's completely black. The same dynamic is in effect with regard to the President of the United States really unable to visit London, because his physical presence next to Her Majesty the Queen would disgrace the Queen. And so everybody in British politics understands this. And this same dynamic is at play if you contemplate a funeral for whether it's President George Herbert Walker Bush, 41, or a John McCain. The President of the United States is too small a figure, too unworthy a man to be able to stand up in front of that church, in front of a service, and memorialize appropriately great and worthy men. And that's a tragedy. It's a tragedy for the country. It's a tragedy for the generation of kids that's growing up and seeing and having imprinted on them that this is what a President of the United States is. And so when we talk about John McCain specifically and his life, it's beyond any capacity that Donald Trump has to bestow the virtues that John McCain has lived, his heroism, his valor, his toughness, his grit. Donald Trump can't take that away, and a crass White House aide can't either. The point is that those values that John McCain represents, service to Donald Trump's selfishness, sacrifice to Donald Trump's greed, heroism to Donald Trump's cowardice, reconciliation and forgiveness to Donald Trump's mean-spirited and vengefulness, John McCain's capacity to stick up for the little guy, Donald Trump's bullying. The values that McCain represents with his story, that he has come closer to obtaining, reaching, than any other public figure in the country over the last generation. These values are necessary in the life of a nation. It's what built the country. It's what built Canada. They are as necessary for the country as air and water and sunlight are for the forest. And those values are in fundamental competition now. What Trumpism represents is not good. It's not moral. It's not righteous. It's not honorable. And so it's not about the man, and it's not about the personality, and it's not about the insult. It's about the profound and necessary fight over these values that define this man's life and that are under assault by this administration. And that's what the issue is.
Yeah. So, on topic, but not down here. So when Melania Trump is sitting at number 41's funeral, not 40, at Barbara Bush's funeral, what is she thinking as a first lady?
Probably that's what a president looks like.
Very good. Very, very good. Next topic. So the U.S. is juggling North Korea, Iran, Israel, and China too. So if we could just tackle them one at a time. So North Korea, the stakes are extremely high. Would you buy a non-refundable ticket to Singapore for June the 12th?
Well, extraordinary. A great service was done by the 18 members of the Congress who, upon the announcement of the meeting between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, and by the way, what could go wrong with those two in the room, right? The 18 members of the Congress nominated Donald Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize, which I thought was great because now we know for sure who the 18 dumbest members of Congress are. When we look at North Korea, it's a slave state. It is the most oppressive government on earth. Significant percentage of the North Korean population lives underground in slave labor detention camps, concentration camps. There are 12,000 North Korean artillery pieces ranged on Seoul. They have been hardened into mountainsides on a 60-year basis. The casualty estimates for the first day of the Second Korean War would be 1 million killed. There would be more Americans killed in the first 5 minutes of a Korean War II than have been killed in the wars in the Middle East over the last 18 years. The last time the Korean War was fought, South Korea was the third poorest country in the world, and now it's either the 7th or 8th largest economy in the world. How is it that when we look at the world, that the event that seared the national identity for Australia at Gallipoli 100 years ago, how is it that Australian sons wound up in Gallipoli following the shooting of a minor royal in 1914, the Archduke Ferdinand? Everything is connected. The United States Army and the United States Marine Corps, the Marine Corps specifically, is now small enough to fit inside the University of Michigan football stadium in its entirety, in seats. Our military isn't big enough to fight, to hold, and occupy Korean territory, not without a draft. Now, what happens if we have a military provocation on the Korean Peninsula at the same time Vladimir Putin decides to test Article 5 of NATO in the Baltic republics? Trump has already signaled that he's at best indifferent. Putin's stated objective is to weaken the Atlantic Alliance, and from my perspective, it seems that the President of the United States is marching in lockstep with that. We look at what's happening in Israel. We see Israeli strikes on Iranian positions in Syria. We see 1,300 people shot yesterday, and we see the forming of a new alliance with the United States, Saudi Arabia, and the Israelis and the Emiratis on one side, The Iranians, the Russians, the Syrians on the other. The United States is on the Sunni side of the equation. The Russians on the Shia. And the Europeans are neutral to antagonized by the United States, and the President of the United States is talking about imposing sanctions on European countries. So all of these issues are connected to each other, and all of these issues are increasingly dangerous by a president who has no idea what he's doing. I mean, it is clear when you watch him speak on television that it is gibberish. It is the musings of an imbecile when he talks about trade and NAFTA and alliances. And so there is nuance in American diplomacy because there are parts of the world where saying the wrong thing gets people killed. So, for example, it has long-term been that, and asked in a presidential campaign, do we support moving the embassy to Jerusalem? Yes. So long as it doesn't actually ever move. In the same way that the United States has a defense and security arrangement with Taiwan that we don't officially recognize. Now, Trump's rashness there, I said on television this week, leaves blood on his hands. Trump destabilized, Hamas provoked, Israel responded, and the cycle will repeat itself now. All the while destabilizing that region and making it more dangerous. And the reason that Trump did it was for a news conference. It's a reality show, and he wanted the headline.
It was really evident on Monday when they moved the embassy and Jared Kushner got up to speak, and when he kept praising his father-in-law, and then when he said, and we pulled out of Iran, that's when he got the standing ovation. And that's when you just felt that the world was going to start to divide up as Europe starts to go with Iran. And how many were killed? 58 killed,
58 killed, 1,300 shot, which was the goal of Hamas, right? Hamas, which cares not for human life, is raising a generation that their highest aspiration is to be a suicide bomber. And Hamas got what it wanted. Responding to the instability, they provoked a response from the Israelis, and the cycle repeats. And so Jared Kushner, the son-in-law, which by the way is why there should be nepotism laws that actually are enforceable, right? This kid knows nothing about anything. He's a privileged kid, a trust fund billionaire, who's made one commercial transaction on this Fifth Avenue building, which is in foreclosure, almost, who doesn't have a security clearance, which means that he lacks the information to be able to speak intelligently about anything in that part of the world. It's inappropriate for him to be at that opening. And this idea that the son-in-law is going to be in charge of Middle East peace, reinventing government, redesigning the civil service is an absurdity. And so we saw this whole sick show play out with Jared and Ivanka with the real-world consequences.
And Mnuchin.
Falling behind it. And it's a deadly serious business in that part of the world, which I've spent a fair amount of time in. And one of the things I think when you see the blustering, we are at the exact moment in time where the last of the generation who stormed the beaches in Normandy, who survived the death camps, who were living witnesses to a global cataclysm that killed 80 million people, are coming to the end of their long lifespans. And I think that across the West, and certainly in the United States, there is a real lack of imagination for the capacity of a president as ill-informed, ignorant, and incompetent as this one to precipitate a cataclysm where millions of people are killed. And I think there's generally speaking, a real lack of imagination about the fragility of the global order, of our institutions, of peace itself in the world. And so everybody should be worried as we see these spots in the world and the rashness of the actions.
Yeah, I think that I was telling you last night, or someone at the table, that we bought a painting recently from 1936 of Nazis killed Jews, and that was before the Holocaust, before the real problem. And it scares me that are we going through that right now? And when you see, I think you've talked about this on the air, is that Pastor Jeffries, and I have to read it, is Islam is an evil religion, the Catholic Church is led astray by Satan, and Mormonism is a cult. Is that ignorance, or is that on purpose that that pastor's there?
No, look, I mean, so all of these religious evangelicals that have fused to political parties, okay? So we're talking about these mega church pastors that are a part of the evangelical movement, Jerry Falwell Jr., Franklin Graham, some of the more famous names, these two nutjob pastors, Hagee and Jeffries, who are inappropriately giving the prayer at the opening of the convention, have made terribly anti-Semitic statements, anti-Islam, anti-Catholic. These are not men of God. These are businessmen and politicians. And the one great glory of the Trump era is we don't ever have to pretend in America ever again that any of these people are on the level, right? With their hypocrisies and their defenses of Donald Trump at all cost. Very specifically, all of these people were lined up 100% to support the pedophile candidate in the state of Alabama, Judge Roy Moore, right, who's credibly accused of sexual relations with a dozen 14-year-old girls. And so these quote-unquote men of God are all lined up on this. They're in business. They're in business to make money. It's about politics. And anywhere you look in the world and you see the fusion between power and religion, whether it's Putin and the Russian Orthodox Church, whether it was the Catholic Church in fascist Italy, in Spain, through South America, whenever you see proximity of these types of politicians to power, you see autocracy, you see undemocratic impulses, you see virulent hatred towards gay people, and you see real retrograde views on women everywhere, no matter where you look in the world. So these people, the religious right, whatever you want to call it in the United States, these truly are the modern day Pharisees. These are the money changers in the temple that Christ threw out of the temple. And so all of these people are supportive of a theocratic, extreme political agenda that we don't talk enough about. So they have a strategic aim in terms of accumulating power, and there is no manner of hypocrisy that is too great for them not to participate in as they seek to accumulate it. And, you know, Mike Pence, a Titanic fraud. Right?
Before let's jump ahead to Mike Pence. Did Mike Pence make a tactical error saying he's going for 2024? Did he circumvent Ivanka Trump saying he's going? Did he circumvent Trump trying to extend from 2 terms to indefinite terms like China? Or similar to Bannon, when we saw Bannon on the cover of Time magazine in December, I leaned over to Chris and I said, he's out. because Bannon stepped into the Trump spotlight. Tell us about Pence.
As a native of New Jersey, I usually would come to an event this size with a translator, so I apologize for the accent. I don't know if it's a New Jersey thing, that it's a cultural bias of mine, but when I look at Mike Pence speak, it is inconceivable to me that there are other actual adult human beings in America who think this guy is anything other than completely full of shit, right? I cannot wrap my head around that, right? But the whole idea that Mike Pence, who is a titanic fraud, I'm a Christian, I'm a conservative, I'm a Republican in that order, with his practiced faux sincere squint, his adoring Stepford wife gaze that he gives to Trump, the fact that in a cabinet meeting he praised his leader every 3.2 seconds for 12 minutes uninterrupted. He doesn't act like the Vice President of the United States, he acts like the house butler at Mar-a-Lago, right? Stroking Trump's narcissistic erogenous zones, right, with his sweet nothings. And the notion that this guy conveys any virtue other than insincerity and weakness and hypocrisy, and that he thinks he's going to be the President of the United States in 2024, it's completely delusional, all right? It's that what we will see in this November election is a massive, and I mean massive, repudiation of Trumpism. There is no Republican anywhere in America, unless they are in a seat that is plus 25 points, that's safe. Because you've seen in these special elections, Democrats winning districts that are plus 18, plus 19, plus 22 Republicans. So we're going to see a massive repudiation of Trumpism. Now, of course, the Democrats will immediately misinterpret that. And they will say, it wasn't a repudiation of Trumpism, it was a validation of us. The people love us again. People hate them too, right? The only difference is they hate the people that are in power more at any one time. And so, is it possible that Trump gets reelected? Yes, because if you had a bunch of us up here who had run and won presidential campaigns and gave us all truth serum and blinded the poll numbers between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, every one of us would say neither one of these people could ever get elected president of the United States. No chance. However, there's an exception to that rule, which is when two unelectable candidates run against each other, one of the unelectable candidates wins. And in this case, it was the unelectable candidate, from the reality show who wins by 78,000 votes across 3 states. And so could that happen again? Could Elizabeth Warren versus Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders versus Donald Trump? Maybe you have an independent candidacy, that there's a moment of disruption in American politics that's at hand. I think there is, but anything is possible. But in this midterm election, it's going to wipe out this Republican majority in the Congress.
So you've got Paul Ryan stepping down, and
Yes.
you've got 36 Republicans that won't be there for the midterms. Definitely then they're not there for 2020. They're reading the tea leaves?
Yeah, of course. They know they're going to lose.
They don't want to be a backbencher.
Not being in the minority is not fun. Everybody wants to skate off the ice on their own, not get carried off, and so they want to go out. They want to go out undefeated. I mean, we talked about this a bit last year, and a little bit at dinner last night. I mean, the whole American system of government, and the genius of it, is the founders of the country knew one day we would have a President Trump. They predicted it. The entire structure of government is set up anticipating. Now, I think they'd be surprised it took 242 years to get there, but here we are. The one thing that they never anticipated was that the Congress, a co-equal branch of government in the American system, would fail so startlingly to do its institutional duty, to have oversight, to put a check. And so part of this repudiation that's coming is in response to that, is that the entirety of the Republican Party, lock, stock, and barrel, has lashed itself to the mast on the SS Trump. They're going over the cliff, down with the ship, for reasons that are hard for me to understand, but on issue after issue after issue, every orthodoxy of the modern conservative movement has been discarded in the course of a year. You talk about Robert Mueller, this is somebody the conservative mind is hardwired to admire. Princeton University, United States Marine Corps, decorated for valor multiple times in the Vietnam War, director of the FBI after 9/11. The attacks on institutions, the attacks on the system, the chance of lock up our political opponents, lock up journalists, all of this craziness that has been loosed is absolutely 180 degrees from everything they believed 2 years ago. It's just profoundly corrupted, and there's going to be an enormous electoral consequence to that.
So with Mueller and to Cohen, and starting with Flynn, which I think protecting his son, now it's turned into follow the money, and Cohen and ATT and Ford and Novartis and all those names coming out. I'm not being facetious. Is this business as usual, and Cohen's crime is getting caught?
The corruption is at a banana Republican level. It is astounding in the United States to see this. I mean, you have a deal where the two private equity funds come into the White House for a meeting with Kushner, and a couple days later, there's $600 million of loans to his building. I mean, this is the type of stuff you saw go down in Zaire in like 1975. I mean, you go see the president's like brother-in-law, right? I mean, it is astounding. I think it is very clear there is corruption everywhere you see, from the EPA administrator to other cabinet officials. They are pigs at a trough. They are pigs at a trough. And we will see, where the investigation goes on all of this. I do know this, having been at a senior level at two presidential campaigns, if I got a call through a Russian, and by the way, those two presidential campaigns, there were no Russians anywhere. I never met a Russian. There's Russians everywhere in politics now, right? I remember when, you could work in Republican politics without speaking Russian. When you get a call saying, essentially, you want to meet with a bunch of Russians to get dirt on the Democratic opponent. Well, the only appropriate thing to do when that happens is you call the FBI. Because it's not an attack on the Democratic candidate, it's an attack on the United States of America and our election process. And our election process has been paid for in blood for 2 centuries so that we could be a free people. And each generation, I believe, is connected to the generations not yet born. We are trustees of a great inheritance. We're entitled to nothing. And so there's nothing more important than the preservation of free and fair elections in a democratic society. And the interference and the attacks and the misinformation campaign that's underway, you're damn right this administration's complicit with it. Either as useful idiots, which is the Kremlin term for a Western stooge who does their work for them, unknowingly or unwittingly, or directly. And so we're going to find out everything that happened here. And I suspect by the time it's all said and done, it will be the greatest scandal in the history of the United States. There will be astounding levels of information about the depth of the conspiracy. And for sure, we know a lot more than we did a year ago just by what's breaking on the news, but we know a thimble of knowledge compared to what the special counsel Robert Mueller knows. And we may be careening full on into a constitutional crisis if Trump doesn't testify, but we're about to have a great national civics lesson about two things: the rule of law and our institutions. And they're about to be tested, as are those values that we talked about earlier in competition.
So it sort of touches on where I was going to go next, but do you see any parallel paths between a Clinton outcome and a Nixon outcome? And I'll just tie it in because we're on Mueller. Do you feel that Mueller has some sort of unbelievable, you're alluding to, amount of information or smoking gun that he would get that unprecedented search warrant of the president's lawyer's office and home?
I mean, getting a search warrant for the president's personal attorney is pretty remarkable. And not hard to, it's not easy to get a search warrant. It's especially not easy to get a search warrant of any attorney, in particular the president's attorney. He was signed off by 6 different levels of officials in the Department of Justice. It goes through an unbelievably rigorous process. And again, we're on TV talking about Michael Cohen, and I said, I'll stay out of the legal analysis, but I'll give you some North Jersey analysis. I said, this guy's as mobbed up as Maury the wig maker from Goodfellas, 100%. And the thing about the investigation, I mean, their crime family, it's really a dumb fella's family, right? It's like science fiction meets The Godfather. We've traveled into the future and they've cloned Fredo 50 times. And that's the Trump organization up against, the Mueller investigation. And it's just extraordinary to watch. We will find out everything that happened in due time as this investigation goes. But, there's dozens of people that have already been indicted. There's Russian agents, there's collusion, there's money laundering, obviously. There's shadiness at every conceivable level everywhere you look, and it's all going to be rooted out.
Yeah, I just feel like Cohen, when faced with jail time, looks at his family and goes, am I going to pick Trump or I'm going to pick you guys, and rolls over is what we're hoping for. So maybe just to take it back to this room a bit, you touched on NAFTA, but I think it's pretty clear that we sell America more goods than they sell us, and we buy more services from them than they sell us. But you still, there's an imbalance that you sell us over $8 billion more of that $673 billion in trade that we do. Today was the cutoff date. Is this just negotiation? Why is he screwing with it? Is it to get to Mexico and we're thrown in there? Or is it just, there's no reason?
I had a conversation with some of the Canadian team that's involved in the negotiations, and it was back to where Trump had come to Wisconsin and attacked the Canadian dairy industry and the compacts, and I made the point to the Canadian team. I said, well, he only means it if you believe he means it. And they were like, what do you mean? I was like, what do you mean? What do I mean? Right? It's like, this is a reality show. One day, I don't know if it's episode 500 or 480, but he's going to fix NAFTA. And NAFTA doesn't really have to change, really at all, for him to announce the fix. So when we talk about the economy, and we talk about the North American economy, let's look at the 3 nations. So the United States has had a long and complicated history with Mexico, but has had for 35 years a continued and improving arc of good relations, with the Mexican economy liberalizing, including the energy industry, which will make Mexico a wealthy country. There is 0 net illegal immigration coming across from the southern border. the provocations by Trump towards Mexico and Mexicans have fueled the rise of a left-wing Mexican populist named Lopez Obrador, who will certainly be elected president, will almost certainly set about immediately crashing the Mexican economy. And by the way, any guesses in the room where the Mexicans go when their economy crashes? That's right, it's El Salvador, right? No? Right, so Trump, right, is lying about a problem that doesn't exist, and the result of his lie will be to cause the problem that he demagogues. The Canadian-U.S. trade relationship is about $1 trillion. The Great Lakes area alone is $6 trillion of economic activity. It's the longest, largest undefended border in the history of the world. And the reality is that the economies are completely integrated from a supply chain perspective, from a manufacturing perspective. So if the United States were to unilaterally abrogate NAFTA, if he tweets that out in the morning, you know, we'll see what the stock market does, but it's going to go down many, many, many thousands of points. And there would be economic chaos on both sides of the border. And this is something that Republican governors who represent states like Ohio and Michigan understand, because for 35 states, Canada is the #1 trading partner. And so this whole idea of him, Trump, talking about like it's a real estate deal as opposed to transnational, international trade deals with derivative values and effects on the economy is absurd. But it's, you know, the business community on both sides of the border has done a terrible job of communicating the value of NAFTA, of free trade, and for the life of me, I don't understand why there's no public communication about it in Washington, D.C., aimed at the politicians. And it's a real failure, you know, in my view, of both the U.S. and the Canadian business communities.
But isn't your soybean farmer going to elevate this?
Well, I was in Iowa a couple weeks ago, and we were doing this Showtime series, The Circus, and we were talking to, you know, a number of people there, and there was no one in between. I mean, they were either, you know, Trump 100% or, you know, kind of where I'm at. But we're talking to a bunch of farmers, and, you know, we're at, what about Stormy Daniels? You know, he lied about this, he did this, and nope. So are you worried that the Chinese just canceled $18 billion of soybean orders? Like that, I go from talking to someone in the Trump cult to a very sophisticated multi-millionaire agro-businessman. And he goes, of course I'm concerned. He goes, because when markets dry up and they go to Brazil, they don't come back. Supply chain, sourcing, the cost of shipping, they're gone. And I said, well, whose fault will that be? The farmer goes, well, that would be Trump's fault. I said, so you'll blame Trump? I said, you blame Trump for starting the trade war? And he goes, yes. 100%. That's Trump. So we look at Israel, right? We see now the consequences of policies, destabilization, people are dead. We look in Iowa, right? We see farmers now, they're going to lose money in markets. The consequences of Trump and Trumpism and who pays the bill is now starting to be felt in some places and in some sectors that were sympathetic to Trump. And that will have a real-world impact in the country politically, for sure.
That moderate Republican that was with him, if he's at 42% now, how does he?
There are no moderate Republicans with Trump, right? I'm serious about this. The die is cast. Everyone's all in. Right? We talk about the never Trump wing of the Republican Party, there's like 11 of us.
12.
Right? And none of us are in office. But the Congress, such as it is, they are lock, stock, and barrel with Trump.
Okay. So his base has been promised, let's make America great again, let's get the jobs back. But Walmart has spoiled the consumer with low costs. is his base going to pay more for Made in America? Or
Yeah, of course. Of course.
knowingly?
Look, at the end of the day, the perniciousness of Fox News is this. It's not just the dishonesty, which it is. It's the assignment of blame for everything to dark, conspiring forces working against you, the other. And it's usually black and brown people stealing jobs, cutting in line, the deep state, conspiracy. It's the assignment of blame. So, very quickly, how's Donald Trump get elected? Well, 44% of the United States of America, the population, doesn't have $400 cash available for an emergency. There are more payday lenders than there are Starbucks. And there are almost as many payday lenders as there are Starbucks and McDonald's put together. And there are a shit ton of Starbucks and McDonald's in the United States. There are 3 economic strata in the country. There is a above the line, about a third of the country, and these people are living longer, more prosperously, better than any human beings have lived in all of history. And these people, coastal, elite, wealthy, have more in common with people living in Metro Vancouver and Toronto and Brisbane and Melbourne and Sydney and Berlin and Geneva and London and Paris and Singapore than they do with people living in Akron, Ohio. We have a second economic strata in the country, which is vestigally middle class. These people believe 3 things. They believe that, number one, they are one misfortune away from economic calamity, a kid's broken leg, a sick spouse. They believe their kids will be worse off than they are, and they believe that there is a much greater likelihood that they will be pulled down into the bottom third. Now, the bottom third of the country, which is actually larger than a third, but for simplicity's sake, we'll make it a third. We have no positive economic indicators at all anywhere. 400,000 Americans were killed in the Second World War. We will lose between 500,000 to 700,000 to the opioids in the next 10 years. In this population overrepresented. We see rising infant mortality rates. We see rising maternal labor death rates for the first time in the history of the country. Just as was the case at the fall of the Soviet Union, we see declining life expectancies for white men between 40 and 49. All of working America, working class people, have not seen a wage increase in 25 years. So when that happens altogether, it destabilizes politics and it erodes trust, faith, and belief in institutions and systems. Which is why when a Harvard professor does a survey and he asks people born in the 1930s, how essential is it to live in a democracy, the answer is 85%. When they ask the question of people born in the 1980s, it's 25%. Right? Trust, faith, and belief are the lubricants of the engine in a democratic society. Now, what is the defining event for this generation of Americans? It is the economic collapse in 2008. And what they see? One set of rules for people above the line. They get the $1 trillion bailout. The bankers keep the 8-figure bonuses. 13 million American families below the line get a foreclosure notice. 12 million lose their jobs, and no one goes to jail. So how is it that someone votes for Bernie Sanders in the primary and Donald Trump in the general election? It's because that center line on the field, the 50-yard line that separated right and left and Republican from Democrat, where we debated loudly, hyperbolically about incremental differences, is dissipating. And the new line that is forming in politics is a horizontal line, above, below. And you're seeing it all through Europe as well. Bernie Sanders voter, Trump voter in the general, the message is the same, which is the system is not on the level. And that's how Donald Trump got elected, right? This is what people are seeing. And then when we think specifically about the anger of white men in places that have been forgotten, left behind, economically devastated, ravaged by globalization, declining life expectancies, and they turn on the TV, and all they hear is the Democratic Party candidates talking about their privilege, it makes them go crazy.
So last question then is, you're going to be advising somebody for 2020 and for 2024 and for 2028. How?
Jesus, like, oh, there's something wrong with you if you do more than one of these, let alone a third one.
But you're going to. And how do you advise them, knowing that by looking ahead, and it's going to get there by 2040, America will be 48% non-white. By 2049, I believe it's 51%. So how do you advise seeing that trajectory, and how do you advise someone to go against Trump when he got Hillary to say that 44% of the population are deplorables and she still wanted to represent them? How do you advise?
Next president always has opposite virtues to the last president. And the president that will beat Trump is someone who has the capacity to have in their hearts love and empathy for all of their fellow countrymen, which includes Trump voters. You cannot love your country if you hate half the people that live in it. And the next president, one would hope, is somebody that understands conceptually that we are all in it together. There is no formula for half the country winning and half the country failing. Doesn't work. And so we have a lot of work to do. But America, sadly, today, is not talked about the way that it was talked about at a previous time. Today is America is talked about as a place where people live and things happen. Some tragic, some good, but we don't talk about the country as an idea and an ideal. And the idea is the most perfect idea ever put to paper by the mind of man, and one of its most radical and revolutionary. The notion that all men are created equal and are endowed by a creator with inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This breathed life into the country at its birth, the pursuit of happiness. Now, we have a generation that may well think that the pursuit of happiness is becoming a billionaire, not a poet, or a writer, or an actor, or a priest. Who knows? The pursuit of happiness is very subjective. It's very unique. Over time, through great sacrifice and struggle, that expression of all men has come to include African Americans and Hispanics and Asians and women and gays. The whole story of the country, which is a flawed country because it's made up of people who are flawed, has been the struggle and the fight to fulfill the promise of the country and that idea and that ideal. And everything in the American story is about that fight, about that fight to get there, right? To the idea and ideal. Now, Trump pulls us further away from it. A president can come into office and move us closer to it. One of the things that's true about the country is that, almost in a providential sense, it has produced the right leaders at the right moment. Abraham Lincoln, when he took office, the first Republican president in 1860, he was derided by William Tecumseh Sherman, who would go on to become one of the great commanders of the Union Army in the Civil War. And Sherman said of Lincoln, he said basically that the country is doomed. We've elected a backwoods barbarian who's uneducated, who has no capacity to handle the dimensions of the problem. He last saw Lincoln 2 weeks before his assassination. He saw him with General Grant at City Point in Virginia, the Union hub, and it was the last time they would meet. And when he was asked to reflect on Lincoln after the assassination, what Sherman said of Lincoln was that I have met all of the great men of the world. I have met kings and emperors and generals and industrialists, but I have never met any man who possessed more of the qualities of greatness and goodness than Abraham Lincoln, who even at the end of the bloodiest civil war in the history of the world to that time, and per capita one of the bloodiest in all of history to this day, he talked about, with malice towards none and charity towards all, let us bind up the wounds of the nation. Let us care for the widow and the orphan. Charity, forgiveness, grace. One of the things, and if I'll take a minute just to tell a short story about John McCain and bring it full circle. Most people don't know that John McCain was the chaplain when he was in prison. And they also don't know about his relationship with a legendary Arizona congressman of the Democratic Party, Mo Udall, who went to run for president in the 1976 election. One of my favorite New Hampshire presidential stories is when Mo Udall walks into a barber shop in New Hampshire and he says, "Hi, I'm Mo Udall running for president." And the barber said, "We were just laughing about that." When Mo Udall was dying in an old veterans hospital in Washington, D.C., in the fog of Alzheimer's, John McCain would go and sit by his bedside long after he had left power and office, and he would read to him. When you consider the torture that he endured, solitary confinement, being taken out of the cell every couple of hours, to be beaten, tortured, and all he had to do to make it stop was to say, "I'll go home early. I'll go home out of turn." And he made an affirmative choice that he would rather die than dishonor his family, the United States Navy, and break the code of conduct. But his legacy is not as a prisoner, it's as a peacemaker. Think of the capacity for love that you have to have in your heart to go back to a place where you were brutalized and put the hatred down and put the anger down and forge a new beginning. If you go to Vietnam, the first generation of Vietnamese in 1,000 years to live in independence and peace are the generation that was born after 1985, and they're looking forward. They're not looking backwards. And they revere John McCain as somebody who has given a new birth of hope that the two countries can be friends and their people can know each other. That is a great gift, right? As he nears the end of a long life, and we think about those qualities that are represented by a remarkable story. All of those qualities and characters will have to be put into battle against their opposite, which is represented by Trump. And so dishonest progressivism is not the antidote to Trump. Mean-spiritedness is not the antidote to Trump. The antidote to Trump is something better, something bigger, something that brings people together. And that is the signal test for the presidential candidates who seek to replace them. Who will measure up? It's not a time for smallness, though we see it everywhere. Last point, and I promise I'll shut up. Everywhere you look, you can find acts of decency and kindness and love and competence. I'd say to all the dads and moms in the room with young daughters, play for your daughter the cockpit recording of the female Southwest Airlines captain, former U.S. Navy fighter pilot, when the engine explodes at 36,000 feet. I don't think her pulse gets above 65. Think of James Shaw at the Waffle House. Were there some white folks in there thinking that James Shaw might be there to rob it? Maybe there were, but he saved their lives a couple minutes later when he took out a guy running at him who showed up with an AR-15 to mow down the place. When the Las Vegas shooting happened, African-American named Johnny Smith, 33 years old, he ran into the gunfire. He saved 33 people's lives. He was going for a group of kids when he was shot twice in the neck. And then a white cop ran into the gunfire to save his life. That is also America. And so the American people are far better than their corrupt politicians in Washington, D.C. And at the end of the day, right, the only people who can fix this are the American people. And so there is an enormous choice coming. And if we go down the wrong path, then what the country was and what it's been is going to be something different. And that will be a tragedy beyond my ability to describe here today. And I hope it is not the case and that won't happen. But at any rate, thank you very much, and it was a real pleasure getting to spend some time with you.
Just to close it, it is an absolute honor, and to have Steve come up here and do it for Vancouver, to call Steve a friend on my journey, to just really watch that. The only thing that can beat fear is hope. Thank you, and thank you for the time and passion you put into this, Steve.
Thank you.